Good evening, and welcome to the Art Speaks lecture series here at the University of Chicago. This is sponsored by the University of Chicago's Graham School for Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies, along with the Terra Foundation for American Art and the Driehaus Foundation. This is the sixth in a series of 9 free lectures focused on the series of this year of Art and Design Chicago. I wanted to introduce Neil Harris, who is our speaker tonight on Hyde Park, Kenwood's art legacy from 1889 to 1970. Mr. Harris is the Preston and Sterling Morton Professor Emeritus in the Departments of History and Art History in the Committee on Geographical Studies here at the University of Chicago. The author of over 100 papers and reviews, as well as 9 books. Excuse me, Mr. Harris started at the University of Chicago in 1969 and taught there until 2008. He received his undergraduate degrees from Columbia in 1958 and Cambridge University in 1960, and his PhD from Harvard in 1965. He can introduce himself a little bit further because I know he's got a long background in the history of Chicago art and architecture, but I wanted to also thank him because way back about 23 years ago, he was on my dissertation committee. So, Mr. Harris, looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, Fred. I'll just adjust this slightly. Yeah, I'm not going to say anything more about myself, and I'm glad the introduction was short, and that's the way I prefer it. Anyway, thank you for coming, and I'm happy to be speaking here tonight as part of this large program that the Terra and other institutions are sponsoring. In honor, in part, of the bicentennial of Illinois statehood. I hope we all make it another 100 years, but time will tell. Now, it could be argued that, like politics, art has long been local. At least during the years before digital culture essentially globalized taste and practice. Aspiring as well as accomplished artists, collectors, and art lovers, and I'll be talking about all of them tonight, once were nurtured by patrons and institutions nearby. Access to art, especially for those who didn't travel in those years, was also local and immediate. Chicago is a city whose history has been heavily defined by its neighborhoods. Sometimes by segregation forced upon it, but certainly by the character, the ethnic character in many cases, of the people who live there. It's the intersection between art and neighborhood that I want to talk about here, and of course one in particular, Hyde Park. Now, when I prepared this, I wasn't certain whether I'd be speaking in Hyde Park or not. And I don't know how many people know much about Hyde Park, so I'm going to introduce a few things about Hyde Park as I start. Hyde Park was an active community from the 1860s on, but its transformation from quiet suburb to cultural hub comes really in the 1890s with 2 major events, which I'm illustrating on screen, hosting the World's Columbian Exposition and absorbing the newly established University of Chicago. Each left an imprint on the larger world, but each would also transform the neighborhood, attracting outsiders, investors, and new residents who were drawn to the resources left in the wake of these 2 institutions. Over the next 70 or 75 years or so, which is the period I'll be talking about, up until the 1960s, Hyde Park would really develop its own artist communities, art collectors, and art institutions. Their history has never really been told as a single story, and essentially I'm telling or attempting to tell an integrated story tonight, drawing on the research that many others have done. A comprehensive synthesis is really out of my reach at present, but I think there's enough interesting material right where we are. Now, I treat only the first half of Hyde Park's history, ending really in the 60s, about the time that I arrived here. The area then was emerging from strenuous urban renewal to assume some of its present physical character. Change has brought diversity. Change has also brought losses, more particularly the losses of small businesses, shops, studios, and cheap housing in favor of franchised commercial land use and strip malls and shopping centers. And of course, Harper Court, the first Harper Court, if you will, created in the 60s, was an attempt to compensate for these losses. The quirky nature of this neighborhood, sprinkled with saloons, performance venues, and bookstores, has been diluted, I think, but not totally destroyed. Independence, activism, and self-celebration are part of the Hyde Park ethos. I also end about this time because events, movements, and new institutions were transforming the entire South Side in the 1960s. Socially aware public art, the Wall of Respect, the Civil Rights Movement, Afro-Cobra, the Harry Who, the 60s and 70s see dramatic change. And all of that is gone into, by the way, in an exhibition that has just opened at the Smart Museum, also supported by the Terra and the Driehaus, and of course, an exhibition on Margaret Burroughs in the DuSable. All of that really is the next period. In Hyde Park, the Smart Museum of Art would open in the early 70s. The DuSable Museum itself moves into Washington Park at just about the same time, a dozen years after its founding. Margaret Burroughs, who was an artist herself and its founder, spent time in Hyde Park, but did not live here. The somewhat older Hyde Park Art Center, first on 57th Street, then on Blackstone Avenue, and a crucial part of the art scene, would move to the Del Prado Hotel on Hyde Park Boulevard. These three institutions transform accessibility over the next 4 decades or so, creating what is a new pluralism in Hyde Park's art history. And just about this time, the Venerable Renaissance Society itself, and I'll talk more about that later, changed focus and leadership as well. So this period, the 60s and 70s, is something of a watershed. The exhibitions that just opened at the Smart and the DuSable argue for influential new beginnings in today's South Side. But I have a different story to tell today, somewhat quieter. This earlier period is not pluralistic. It's dominated by white artists and patrons, reflecting the neighborhood's color in those years. Restrictive covenants made residence almost impossible for black artists before the 1960s, and I'll give you one example. This is a panel from the splendid Charles White exhibition hosted by the Art Institute this year. And here is a map of Charles White's artist biography. Downtown and Bronzeville are well represented, and here's a close-up, as you can see. Hyde Park is not. It's just emptiness on the map, in the eastern part of the map. Much has changed in the last 50 years, but the earlier story, I think, is worth recording, and it's the one that I have to tell you. During the 70 years or so that I'm covering, Hyde Park attracts artists, writers, and critics lured by cheap rents, proximity to the Indiana dunes, where many of them worked, good transport downtown, the presence of clients, the University of Chicago, and by the small-town feel in a larger city. In recalling some of these artists today and some of the supporting institutions, I will have to be brief and selective, and there really are many artists to choose from. They all deserve more attention, and they are getting some this year, particularly with new publications and exhibitions. Some words of definition, particularly for the non-Hyde Parkers, 1889 is the year that the village of Hyde Park was added to Chicago. Hyde Park, the village, which you see here on this map, was much larger than Hyde Park, the neighborhood. It was annexed that year along with Lakeview, Lake, and Jefferson townships. And together, the 225,000 people that lived in these areas swelled Chicago's population to slightly more than 1 million. And here you can see the various annexations. Annexation was Chicago's strategy to pull ahead of New York City and become eventually the largest city in the world, which a number of Chicagoans expected. This was a doomed effort, but it died hard. Hyde Park already had its own newspaper, for the Herald was founded in 1882. And here you can see Hyde Park in 1885, not exactly a metropolis. The immediate neighborhood was really something of a pastoral suburb, although the larger independent township, as I mentioned, the village, stretched all the way south to Pullman. Thus, Hyde Park had been immune from the city of Chicago's stringent building regulations, which were a legacy of the Chicago fire. No wooden buildings, so our rustic feel was fed by all of the wooden houses that were built in that period. Where are Hyde Park's boundaries? I accept the Hyde Park Historical Society's take that includes the area running between Cottage Grove and the lake and from 47th to 60th Streets, and includes South Kenwood. This is Greater Hyde Park. It takes in a portion of Jackson Park and, of course, the area that the Columbian Exposition occupied, and that portion of Kenwood as well. But it does not include the art world of Bronzeville. Now, I start perhaps unexpectedly, because the earliest Hyde Park art movement that I examine was neither painting nor sculpture, but crafts, and part of an international trend. All over the world and all over the Midwest, potters, printers, textile designers, silversmiths, carpenters, furniture makers were reacting against prevailing taste and industrialization, the cheapening effects of mass production and industrialization, in their preference for handcrafted objects. And this interest spanned classes. This was called by some popularly the arts and crafts movement, and it veered into what would become known as Art Nouveau. It was popular among upper middle class Americans who envisaged personal regeneration from the movement, and it influenced Hull House reformers as well, like Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, who were concerned with giving dignity to hand labor. One Hyde Park institution that played a role in all of this was the Blue Sky Press, whose short life lasted from 1899 until about 1907. This was a middle-class operation. Its books and magazine were produced at a series of local addresses from 47th and Kenwood and from 57th and Lexington Avenue, which is today's University Avenue. Hyde Park locals, Thomas Wood Stevens, Alden Noble, and Alfred Langworthy, who were college students together, were responsible for the operation. Stevens was the most prominent. He was still in his early 20s, and over time he would become a well-known theatrical producer, a typographer, a designer of masks and pageants for the Art Institute of Chicago, where he taught illustration and mural art. Stevens also created an enormous pageant for the city of St. Louis and produced his own book on lettering. The press produced more than 30 books and a magazine, and you can occasionally run across Blue Sky products in used bookstores. If you can find used bookstores, there are not too many left. Now, this was a book they published, as you can see, in 1902, and one copy was hand-colored, and that was another passion of amateurs during this era, hand-coloring, sometimes very beautifully, these printed texts. These texts featured young poets and graphic artists including a number of poster makers like W.J. Enright here in Chicago, and Edward Penfield, a famous poster designer. You can see his work illustrated in The Blue Sky. He didn't live in Chicago, but he did produce this significant poster for the Kenwood Country Club. Their shifting places of production suggested the presence in the neighborhood already of a group of poets, book artists, and topographers. And one of the most interesting, and I just show examples of her work, was Emma Elizabeth Caldwell, who was one of the few women topographers in this era, also a publisher of books on handwriting, and heavily influenced by Japanese woodblock prints, and this is all her work to the right. Some of these artists were here, no doubt, because of the recent World's Fair and the new university. I am leaving aside the fair's, the Columbian Exposition's art history, because that was a temporary experience and it inhabits a realm of its own. It's received a lot of attention, and there's an exhibition currently that just opened at the Newberry Library on the imaging of the World's Fair, which I commend to your attention. But the University of Chicago, as you will hear, forms a recurrent theme. Artists were drawn to faculty, students, and institutions at the university and by some of the surviving buildings of the World's Fair. And these provided both subjects for them to work on and places in which to live. Certainly, the Blue Sky Press was retrospective in character, summoning up medieval traditions in the William Morris fashion. Another backward-looking remnant of this era, showing the influence of the Columbian exhibition, were the mural paintings done by a non-Hyde Parker, but we recognize the North Side as part of the city, Oliver Dennett Grover, who did these murals for the Blackstone Memorial Library, Chicago's first branch library. This may be the oldest major surviving artwork created explicitly for Hyde Parkers. It was clearly allegorical, if that's not a contradiction in terms. Grover's work reflected prevailing taste and the City Beautiful movement that was in place at that point. It came the same year as another allegorical work, Frederick Clay Bartlett's tribute to athletics that is in the gymnasium built by his father, now a commons, an eating commons. It's still visible. Alas, not still visible is the great stained glass window by Edward Sperry. This is a Tiffany glass window currently in storage. If you have $1 million and would like to donate to its restoration, the University of Chicago will, I'm sure, be happy to hear about it. It was a wonderful window, but again, reflecting what was a strongly medievalist theme in public art in this period. The Crowning of Ivanhoe, which some of you may remember from reading the Scott book. Looking backward would not be typical for future artists of Hyde Park, but the architecture of the exposition and of the university, in the one case neoclassical and the other neo-Gothic, these could hardly be called progressive. Both would be vigorously denounced, of course, by figures like Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright. But despite their apparent endorsement of historicist vocabularies, the university and the Columbian exhibition did indeed give rise to expanded horizons and new tastes. The Columbian exposition helped spawn American interest in French Impressionism, the result in part of the huge French painting display in the Art Palace, as well as a broad fascination with Japanese architecture and design. And the university, perhaps surprisingly, becomes a focal point for contemporary and modern art with the Faculty Foundation of the Renaissance Society, which is created in 1915 and still functions as a gateway for new art. it would soon provide regular opportunities for local artists to show their work along with modernist artists from throughout the world. It was introducing them really to Hyde Parkers. Strong institutions then can be constraining and liberating at one and the same time. A more permanent expression of artistic creativity in Hyde Park than the arts and crafts movement would be closely associated with the university, although located just south of the Midway and very near where we sit. And that was Laredo Taft's Midway Studios, which begins in a former barn and then moves to a coach house. With additions and renovations, it serves to this day. Taft, who was an ambitious young sculptor in search of cheaper quarters, moved here from the Fine Arts Building on Michigan Avenue to 60th Street in 1906, surrounded by his disciples and presumably that cat. Taft is a very important source of art leadership in the early 20th century. If you go through lists of exhibiting artists at the annual Art Institute shows of Chicago area artists in the 20th century, you'll find the address 6016 Ellis Avenue often, and that, of course, was the Midway Studio address. Taft had studied in Paris. He taught at the Art Institute. He was active working at the Columbian Exposition, and in Hyde Park, he undertook a series of commissions and, of course, designed the Fountain of Time, which after many years of construction and planning was dedicated in 1922. Taft proposed also some extraordinary but unrealized plans for the Midway Plaisance, which was to have been flooded and which had a series of bridges with statuary, which would have gone where, one of them, where Woodlawn Avenue is now. Aside from his Chicago work, of course, he gained important commissions across the United States. Some of his most memorable pieces, of course, are in Illinois. Increasingly conservative in his approach to sculpture, Taft devoted much of his time and energy in later years to denouncing abstraction. A further link to Hyde Park lay in the fact that Taft's daughter Emily married Paul Douglas, the University of Chicago economist and Hyde Park alderman, and then Illinois senator. And I'll be turning to them for a brief reprise later on. Despite the early presence of Grover's murals, Blue Sky, and Laredo Taft, the more typical thrust of Hyde Park's art practice would become progressive, modernist, and even experimental. While its artists tended to be representational and moved through various styles, and this is perhaps a broader Chicago characteristic, many were vigorous colorists, a few of them toying with cubism, and abstraction, more of them heirs to Cézanne and perhaps some of the Fauves, influenced as well by the New York Ashcan school painters. They flourished in a popular physical inheritance of this period that a few people, old Hyde Parkers, might recall. 22 leftover one-room shacks on 57th and Stony Island Avenue, built as souvenir stores and concessions by George Beaumont for the World's Fair of 1893. In the 1930s WPA Guide to Illinois, they were described as a forlorn row of sagging barn-like shacks. They turned the corner of 57th and Stony, giving what would become one of the city's more important artist colonies the nickname of the Corner, otherwise known as the Jackson Park Art Colony. This was the center of Hyde Park artist life in the early 20th century and an important asylum for the bohemian world. It coexisted with two other nearby artist nests, one in Cable Court, just to the north, and another further east on 57th. But the Corner, the 57th Street Art Colony, that was really central to Hyde Park art life. There were other artist enclaves, of course, in Chicago, in Old Town, in Tower Town near the Tribune, in the Tree Studios, which were built in 1894 on East Ohio and hosted artists like John Warner Norton and John Storrs, and of course the Fine Arts Building on North Michigan, right near the Athenaeum Building, another host. But the 57th Street Art Colony was probably the city's most exotic site for artists and writers to mix together. And I show you here some of those who were involved with that 57th Street Art Colony, hosting many literary figures for long stays or short visits, among them Floyd Dell and his wife, Margaret Curry, who lived in separate studios, Margaret Anderson, who founded the Little Review, Carl Sandburg, Sherwood Anderson, Ben Hecht, Vachel Lindsay, Susan Glaspel, Theodore Dreiser, and James T. Farrell. And it's a very exuberant group of creators. Thorsten Veblen lived right nearby when he was on the faculty. Sherwood Anderson also lived on 57th Street. Several other artists were housed in an apartment house, Gooded Castle it was known as, on Harper, long since gone. The studios survived until 1961, when, much mourned, they were taken down as part of Hyde Park's urban renewal. And these photographs made just before their final destruction were part of an effort to document what was one of Chicago's most important artist hangouts. The artists who hung around were certainly important members of the larger Chicago art community in the early 20th century, but many of them were also participants in the life of Hyde Park and active in local institutions, and that's one of the themes that I'd like to stress tonight. They were attracted here again by inexpensive physical facilities, the presence of intellectual and cultural life, and the neighborhood's capacity for lifestyle tolerance, which, when it comes to artists, is an important feature and is not characteristic of all neighborhoods in the city. Over the next several decades, there were dozens and dozens of painters, printmakers, and sculptors who were active here. Many of them moved and would move after a relatively short residency to other places. I would mention, for example, Jessie Arms Botke, her husband Cornelis. Jessie Arms Botke, for those of you who know the university campus, was responsible for that amazing set of murals, the Mask of Life. She went to California with her husband. Again, Chicago artists seem to be attracted to warm weather in many instances, and she went native, you might argue. She became known as the Art Deco Audubon in certain circles. She did a series of fabulous bird pictures, and she's well known as a California artist. I'm not claiming her as then exclusively Hyde Park, but she and her husband worked here for some of their formative years. But there are a whole group of others, and I'm just going to show you very brief examples before I get on to talk about a few more in detail. And you see from the upper left, Hyde Park artists Harry Osgood, Tunis Ponson, Flora Schofield, and Earl Reed. And these artists, some of them were primarily graphic artists, etchers or lithographers. Others were painters. Flora Schofield is a particularly interesting artist in my view. She went, well, I'll talk a little bit about her later, but she went to Provincetown and did woodcuts there. She lived at 5024 Ellis before moving north. And again, more of the artists. This is, you can see the posters done by Davis Myers on the lower right. Ralph Pearson did some extraordinary lithographs of Chicago life in 1911, and the others I just mentioned here. And there are some that I'm not even showing, Catherine Merrill of Madison Park, and so on. But describing all of these, or even mentioning them, would just be a procession of images and names, and I wanted to try to avoid that. So let me talk selectively about just half a dozen artists associated with Hyde Park, roughly in chronological order, to give you a sense of what they were about, maybe to introduce some of them to you and illustrate their work. One of these artists, and he's now become fairly known, and this is the kind of quintessential artist as Bohemian portrait photograph, I think. This is someone who came to the 57th Street studios in the years between 1911 and 1913, a master of several media, really accomplished in an extraordinary variety of forms. Bror, B-R-O-R, or B.J. O. Nordfeldt, like many of the Hyde Park and Chicago artists, was an immigrant. He was born in Sweden. He arrived as a teenager. He studied at the Art Institute School. By the age of 20, this photograph, as you can see, was done about 1900, about the time that he was studying in Chicago. While in Chicago, he became friendly with another Scandinavian, Thorsten Veblen. This portrait of Floyd Dell, the editor and book reviewer for the Friday Literary Review, also reflects his brief Hyde Park tenure. Nordfeldt, like Dell, would move. He would move to New York for a while, and while often considered one of Chicago's first post-impressionist painters, he was accomplished in many media, including etching, but he was especially trained in woodcut. These are done early in his career, about the time that, even a little bit, yes, this is 1913, just about the time he was at the 57th Street studios. And I show you another one on this period. He would, in fact, move to Provincetown. And in 1915, he's credited with helping to create the white line woodcut. But he was into many different things. Here's his 1913 painting of Michigan Avenue. He was obviously influenced by a series of important European artists. During World War I, as I say, he spent time in Provincetown on Cape Cod and participated, and this is one more of Nordfeldt's work, done shortly after leaving the 57th Street studios, showing again the variety of his achievement. But this is Nordfeldt helping to create the white line, a movement which is associated with a number of important women artists, Blanche Lazelle, Ethel Mars among them. This was a new Japanese-influenced creation. It was different than most traditional Japanese woodblocks in that only one wood block was created, the white lines keeping the colors apart from one another, but it was a very laborious process. And I just couldn't resist showing you more than one. They are so interesting and effective. By this time, Nordfeldt could not be considered really a Chicago artist at all. And after the war, World War I, during which he worked as a camouflage artist, he moved again to Taos, New Mexico. And there is an important movement of Chicago artists, not only to California, but also to the Southwest, which was the subject of an Art Institute show in the last few years. In later years, Nordfeldt would teach in Minneapolis, Wichita, and other Midwestern cities. He did lithographs for the WPA in the 1930s. Nordfeldt's landscapes, his portraits, and his still lifes have attracted a lot of attention in the last couple of decades, more, I think, than a number of the other Chicago artists of the 57th Street colony, some of whom actually stayed here for long periods. And that includes the next artist I want to mention, Emil Arman. Like Nordfeldt, Arman was born abroad to a Jewish family in Romania. He came to Chicago around 1904, took night classes at the Art Institute. He worked with George Bellows, who was an important influence, along with John Sloan, on a number of Chicago artists, and, as I say, worked at Hull House. This portrait of Armin, by the way, was done by a non-Hyde Parker, but a Chicago artist, A. Raymond Katz, who I'm particularly fond of because Katz was a cover artist and interior artist for the Chicagoan, the magazine that my wife and I worked on some years ago, and he was a friend and did the portrait of Armin for the interior of the magazine. Armin visited the 1913 Armory Show. He was something of a rebel, identifying not with the establishment, but with young artists trying to make their way. And here is of his version, 1930, just about the same time that his portrait was done of the 57th Street studios. At this time, in order to be accepted at annual Chicago Art Institute shows of Chicago artists, a jury system evaluated and then passed verdict on what could be seen. This tended to be heavily academic and traditional. The younger artists were unhappy about it, and so they were challenged by what were called no-jury artists who formed their own society, and Armin was active in these. He did many things: cityscapes, landscapes, religious art, Jewish and biblical. He also did studiously naive prints, and you can see here the woodcut of the 57th Street studios. Some critics have seen the influence of German Expressionism in the 1920s, as well as post-Impressionists, but he did a number of wonderful city scenes. His colors are usually vibrant, as they often are in Nordfeld, and occasionally Armin would veer into the mysterious and surrealistic, like a number of his colleagues. The Renaissance Society here in Hyde Park showed his work in the 1930s and 40s. And he also spent some time in New Mexico, and you can see here how his color palette reflected his sense of the Southwest landscape. Armin stayed here almost all his life, and there is a picture of him you can see here at one of the Hyde Park art fairs of the 1950s. Armin was very friendly with two other artists who I want to talk about very briefly, somewhat more obscure than he is today, but even more active than he was in Hyde Park institutions. And they were married to one another, Francis Strain and Fred Beasel. And this is Francis Strain's portrait of Armin, The Visitor, as it's called, and you can see an affectionate rendition. Often you just see a portion of this presented when Armin is talked about. Artists painted one another as subjects, of course, particularly when they were friendly. To return the favor, Armin himself painted Francis Strain and Fred Beasel in their Hyde Park studio. And the two paintings seem to me to have a certain kind of resemblance. The bright colors, they're clearly representational and slightly askew. The dog, of course, is a nice touch. The Beasels were multi-generational artists. Fred Beasel's father, Charles Beasel, was also a painter, primarily a marine painter, but after moving here, he became part of the 57th Street group. And here you can see his 1939 view of Lake Park and 55th Street on a winter's day, and I think we can all feel that winter's day from this picture. It still looks vaguely like that. Fred Beasel, his son, was like Armin, very active, leading Chicago artist groups in the 1920s and 30s. Along with his future wife, and you can see her here in Beasel's portrait of her, one of my favorites among his pictures. He studied at the School of the Art Institute, exhibited at the Marshall Field Galleries, along with a number of other Hyde Park artists and led the group of no jury artists. His paintings once again display the vivid color fields that characterized a number of the Hyde Park artists, and in the case of this Paris park scene, with its concentration on small plants, also bear a slightly surrealistic flavor, at least for me. Like his father, Fred Biesel did some neighborhood scenes, including this backyard scene, 5542 Dorchester. Eventually, he would become state director of the Illinois Art Project between 1941 and 1943, the very last days of the WPA. And this is a picture of him about that time. The Hyde Parkers, or a number of the Hyde Park artists, were really very active communitarians. His wife, Frances Strain, was just as active a leader. She became exhibition director at the Renaissance Society here at the University of Chicago in 1941, another important venue for contemporary art, and she remained director for more than 20 years until 1962. And the Renaissance Society, her predecessor, Eva Watson-Schutze, was the person who really made the Renaissance Society into a very important venue for introducing Chicagoans to great artists, great modernist artists from throughout the world. And it had a citywide audience attracting visitors to Hyde Park. Along with the Arts Club, it would bring to the attention of local art lovers a series of avant-garde artists and host major shows from the 20s and 30s on. These included the first shows given Mies van der Rohe, Paul Klee, Braque, Picasso, Mondrian, Leger, Calder, and so on, for this city at least. The Renaissance Society was, with the Arts Club, Chicago's portal to modernism. Strain's close friend, Francis Foy, a North Sider, did this portrait of Strain, and I show you again to compare with the one her husband did that I just had on screen. Her relationships to the university were multiple, revealed in one instance by this painting of her son's first-grade class at the laboratory school. Both Strain and Biesel, like other Hyde Park artists, not only painted in Hyde Park, they painted Hyde Park. They studied again with John Sloan and worked with him in New Mexico. They traveled in Europe extensively, and their urban scenes have more than a touch of Sloan's Ashcan legacy, although the brushwork and color are different. But also, Strain has, it's hard to pigeonhole many of these artists. She has her own semi-mystical and surrealist side. Here is her painting of the famed Four Saints and Three Acts, which came to Chicago actually the same year, 1934, that it premiered in Hartford. Gertrude Stein and of course wrote the libretto. And there's another of her pictures that I think is particularly interesting and clearly not just a purely representational work. It has all sorts of, it's laden with all sorts of symbolic issues, life and death in New Orleans in the 1940s. It's also important to recognize the role that artists played while they were faculty members at the University of Chicago many decades before the establishment of the Logan Center, and they offered their own classes in art instruction and employed artists in residence. Midway Studios, after Taft's death in 1936, employed a series of instructors in painting, sculpture, and other forms, and the art history department contained a number of artists in its faculty roles. Some of the artists attached to Midway as instructors were well known, like Ruth Duckworth, the ceramist. Others, like Freeman Schoolcraft, or the director of Midway, William J. Talon, are not. Here, Schoolcraft gets involved in the 1930s with federal arts programs and did a series of panels for the federal building in Peoria, which I show you here. And painters, sculptors, ceramists, lithographers, they were both on faculty and had their work featured in exhibitions at the Renaissance Society and elsewhere, and they also attracted the attention of local collectors. I think the faculty artists of this neighborhood deserve a lot more attention than they have received. Before closing this brief survey, there are three other artists intimately connected with Hyde Park that I want to just say a few words about. The first, George Josimovich, like Armin and Nordfeldt, was born abroad in Serbia, but grew up in Wyoming, came to the School of the Art Institute to study with George Bellows, and he worked closely with another immigrant artist, Herman Sachs, at Hull House. Josimovich moved here to Hyde Park around 1922. He roomed with Emil Armin for a time, had an exhibition in Paris, and led for a while the Chicago Society of Artists and more particularly the No Jury Society of Artists. He would work in the 1930s also for the Illinois Arts Project of the New Deal. He taught, he designed lighting, and he was at home in a variety of media, in oil, in woodcut, and in watercolor. As you can tell, in the 1920s, he was strongly under the influence of Cubism, like a number of other Hyde Park friends, and I'm showing you things he did around the time that he moved here, linocuts as well as paintings. He tried on a number of contemporary styles, like his colleagues in Hyde Park, and this is a painting that is owned by the Terra, in fact, showing his interest in geometric abstraction. Illinois Central, which he would have known from his time in Hyde Park of 1927. He also did this rather interesting painting, which I think it's untitled, of 1924, may have been influenced by the wonderful Portuguese Sousa Cardoso painting that came to the Art Institute as part of Arthur Jerome Eddy's collection. It can still be seen at the Art Institute, and I think the floating fish may have attracted his attention, although I can't say definitively that it did. In any event, he was an artist who moved around a number of different styles, and he lived on to 1986, more than 60 years after doing some of the things, and he was still actively at work in the 1970s, 50 years apart. Another artist of greater contemporary celebrity, indeed the most prominent of all of the Hyde Park painters in today's world, came a full generation after Josimovich and the others I've been describing, and this, of course, was Gertrude Abercrombie, a fixture of the Bohemian community, the Queen of Bohemia, as she was known, and also friendly with artists and musicians almost beyond count. Abercrombie remained here in Hyde Park after some of her colleagues had left, and a lot has been written about her recently. She was featured, among other surrealist artists, in a show at the Arts Club that the Terra helped sponsor just a few months ago. She's the subject of an exhibition at a gallery in New York at the present time, and she continues to fascinate critics and art historians. So I really don't have anything particularly original to add. Her canvases, many of them displayed at 57th Street art fairs, have often a moody, surrealistic tone, a quality, in fact, that she shared with a number of other Chicago artists of her day. Her independent and sometimes flamboyant lifestyle and her active social involvement really made her the center of an entire group of artists, writers, and musicians. And here you can see the famous self-portrait of my sister of 1941, which is at the Art Institute. I'm sorry, let you look at that just a little more, give you a little more time with the strange title, suggesting again the sister. She was an only child, so this is clearly not her sister, but Gertrude Abercrombie was moving in and out of self in many of her pictures. She lived for a while. I don't know if you can make out the address here. It says 5642 Harper, which was where she lived when she did this 1940 painting, now at the Union League Club. She moved in 1944 to this house, which is still standing at 5728 Dorchester. And this house becomes a real fulcrum for jazz musicians. She knew Sonny Rollins, Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Sarah Vaughan, just to name some. She was friendly with Studs Terkel and Marion Dupre and Thornton Wilder, and her parties were famous throughout the city. This is her with Dizzy Gillespie. Her lifestyle suggests that at a time when racial segregation dominates just about every aspect of Chicago life, artists' exhibitions in Hyde Park and other places at art fairs and centers would provide rare opportunities for mingling across racial lines. She was also a great influence on Don Baum, who would become director of the Hyde Park Art Center in the 1950s. The center itself, established in 1939, was a neighborhood space supported by the alderman and future Senator Paul Douglas. And it was in the 1960s, after Baum had spent some years at leading the center, and Ruth Horwich had become its most significant board member, that the center hosted a string of significant exhibitions of the Harry Who. Here is Gertrude Abercrombie, typically seen at the Hyde Park Art Fair. She had a used Rolls Royce at one point and used to drive around the city, and this captures her involvement in the neighborhood. Finally, there was someone that a number of people might remember here. One last artist that I want to talk about, Harold Hayden, who with his brother Ted, the famous track coach at the University of Chicago, was a neighborhood fixture for many years. Harold Hayden had an illustrious career that deserves to be chronicled carefully. He was born in Canada. He moved to Hyde Park with his family in 1917. He went to University High School, and he took undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Chicago in 1930 and 31. He began to teach at local institutions in the early 30s and at the University of Chicago in 1944. Eventually, he would become a member of the art department and actually get a Quantrell Award for teaching. He was art critic for the Chicago Sun-Times for more than 20 years and directed Midway Studios for 12 years. More than that, Hayden was a productive artist and a rather interesting one. Again, I won't have a lot to say. Some years ago, Corbett versus Dempsey, the gallery on the north side, explored his theory of binocular vision and featured some of his later canvases, and I'm just showing you a couple here, which are arresting. I personally find even more appealing Hayden's earlier, more austere and less programmatic work done in the 1930s when he was just beginning his career. He was especially active in the first days of the Hyde Park Art Center. And I'm ending with him as far as the artists go, but there are a number of themes that I just want to highlight for the moment. These artists tended to be fairly cosmopolitan. They were well-versed in art movements taking place in other parts of the world. Many of them traveled and studied there. Secondly, they were multimedia artists. They worked in graphic art as well as painting. Third, they were community involved in the community's own institutions. And finally, a number of them were strong colorists and had a surrealist flavoring. I want, before I end totally, to mention two other aspects of significance to Hyde Park Kenwood's art history. And these go to the theme of what was the larger community in relationship to artists who worked there. First, say something about its collectors, and secondly, a bit more about its exhibiting institutions. Hyde Park, actually, over its history, Hyde Park Kenwood, has hosted many great collectors, some of contemporary art, and I've mentioned one or two of them, others with more traditional, older art interests. The greatest collector in the history of this city, the most important patron of the Art Institute of Chicago, lived in Hyde Park Kenwood, and that was Martin A. Ryerson, whose Drexel Avenue mansion is still standing, as you can see today, and contained fabulous masterpieces stretching across hundreds, if not thousands of years, and many media. Ryerson, in his enthusiasm for Monet and French Impressionism, could also be considered something of a modernist, despite his great range. His art collection was not really open to the public when kept in his home, but it would be transferred in its entirety to the Art Institute in the 30s. And this is a glimpse, I'm sorry the photograph is not in more defined, in the 1920s. He was something of an invisible presence for contemporary artists. He, alas, did not collect American art, so he can't be part of the larger American art story, but he's part of the art story. And so was Max Epstein, who lived in Kenwood at 4906 Greenwood, and who gave in the 1950s a couple of dozen old master canvases of great importance to the Art Institute of Chicago. He would become a trustee and a benefactor of art and medical causes at the university. In fact, Epstein left or gave a promised gift to the university to create an art history building, a research institute that was never built. The Depression intervened. He also was the person who sponsored and entertained Albert Einstein on his 1921 visit to Chicago when Einstein attempted to explain to Chicago journalists unsuccessfully his theory of relativity. These men would be followed decades later by collectors with very different interests and more immediate impact. They come a little bit after the period I'm ending, although they start then, in the 60s, but several of them were nurtured by the university, the Renaissance Society, and the Hyde Park Art Center, already here. They included, for example, Barnett Hodes, who owned a series of Magrittes. He was, in fact, Magritte's attorney, and an active campaigner for public art in Chicago. And there is, well, I guess I don't have the photograph here to show you, but I have a number of other Chicago collectors whom some of you will recognize: Ruth Horwich, Morton and Rose Newman, Ed and Lindy Bergman, to name, and of course, a later alderman in Len Dupre and Marion, who were collectors, as well as John and Eleanor Castle Neff, who were at the top center. Ruth Horwich and the Bergmans were particularly active in local art institutions like the Hyde Park Art Center and the Renaissance Society. The Bergman Gallery, of course, in Cobb Hall on the university campus is the current site. And much of their art would end up in Chicago museums, including the work of masters like Calder, Cornell, Dubuffet, Giacometti, and Max Ernst. John Neff was a founder of the Committee on Social Thought. He collected and was in contact with artists like Marc Chagall and Joseph Albers. And Hyde Park alderman Leon Dupre had a distinctive collection of his own. Then there were the pioneering collectors of African American art, about whom we are just beginning to learn more and should know more. John Johnson, who lived near Drexel Square before his move north, Susan Caton Woodson, Jimmy and Jetta Jones, John Hope Franklin, who of course was on the faculty here for a number of years, among others. While African American artists were still rare in Hyde Park through the 60s, these collectors, many of whom were active in the Southside Community Art Center in Bronzeville, were creating a beachhead. Collectors serve many functions for an active artist community. Some are purchasers from and supporters of local artists, but others can be transmitters, importers of art produced elsewhere, introducing new sensibilities and transforming local taste. Finally, a word about institutions. I've already, in several places, alluded to the impact of the Great Depression of the 1930s and federal art programs. And it's hard to overstate this brief national experiment in art support. Artists throughout the city, including those in Hyde Park, and there are some very significant Hyde Parkers who are active in the WPA, including Mrs. Increase Robinson, who owned a Northside Gallery. They were enlisted in the mural, art education, poster, and other programs that the New Deal sponsored. It was a lifeline to survival in very difficult times, and it left behind some impressive art achievements. However, before the opening of the Smart Museum in 1974 and of the DuSable about the same time, Hyde Parkers interested in historic art, not contemporary, didn't have to go downtown to the Art Institute. Lake Park offered an alternative created by the man you see here at the center, the artifacts in Harding's Castle, a house museum which George F. Harding created in the early 20th century. Harding was a fascinating figure who in some ways typified the eclectic, unexpected blend of personalities that this neighborhood supported. He was a Harvard-trained lawyer, an aviation pioneer, a realtor, a Chicago politician. He was known as Big Bill Thompson's bagman. He was the city treasurer at the time. He lived for a while at 4853 South Lake Park, which was a very different street than it is today. Here you can see a view of the Harding Museum and Castle on Lake Park Avenue. Here's a view of Lake Park, which had buildings on either side before urban renewal changed its character. By all accounts, the Harding Castle was amazing inside and out, with something of the atmosphere of a haunted castle. Armor, musical instruments, paintings, Frederick Remington bronzes, all jostled one another. It was torn down, like the 57th Street Studios, just a few years later than them in 1965. Parts of the collection moved for a while downtown to the corner of Randolph and Michigan in the old Crerar Library building, which would also be taken down and replaced by an office building. But you can see remnants of the Harding collection today in the Art Institute, particularly some of his armor and the Remington bronzes. And this is the new installation in the medieval and Renaissance galleries at the Art Institute, which feature Harding's armor. The romance of the Harding Castle is long gone, but it's a reminder again of the variety that Hyde Park offered art lovers in these years. Being able to walk a few blocks to see exhibitions or visit artist studios or purchase art at galleries was more than a convenience. It really was a true asset. This display culture must have appealed to artists who lived in this area, and they had as well the temporary exhibitions featured by the Renaissance Society, which, as I say, from World War I on, was offering locals modernist experiments, and also presenting in the 20s and 30s the paintings, prints, and sculpture of local Chicagoans. And I just want to show you the variety of shows, the Hemphill Folk Art Collection. This is a show on arts and craft furniture. As you can see, that's a Venice, Save Venice show. As late as the 1970s, the Renaissance Society featured regularly artists in the Chicago area. In the 1950s, it hosted a significant exhibition of African-American artists, and in the early 70s, it had Chicago's first Art Deco retrospective. Most recently, of course, the Renaissance Society has focused on contemporary art making. Much older art than this could be found in the collections of the Oriental Institute, which moved from Haskell Hall in the main quadrangles to its current building. And this was a scholarly enterprise, but I think art interests can be spurred by encounters with collections in the same way that natural history museums and dinosaur bones can jumpstart many a science career. They have an even more impressive effect when they are added to the presence of the lively artist colonies, which were still here when the Oriental Institute opened in this new building. Finally, there was the all-important 57th Street Art Fair, founded toward the end of the era I'm talking about in 1948 by silversmith. So we've gone from craft to craft, as it were. Mary Lou Wormer, and still going. This, what now is a summer perennial, perpetuates the strong physical link between 57th Street and Hyde Park artists. The oldest art fair in the Midwest, it set a pattern which has now gone citywide as these long summer days encourage other parts of the city to host their own. This is, if you will, the climax of the art encounter when artists and craftsmen meet customers, and an exchange is made. It also marks the start of a more vigorous diversity in the story of Hyde Park art. The broader story of Chicago's art fairs, by the way, I think is still to be told and remains largely anecdotal. Volunteer affairs, for the most part, they enlist the support of locals who make them possible. And it's a reminder of the role that local traditions play in providing opportunities for artists and their clients to meet each other. Doing work on all of this has, in a sense, told me how much more I need to know, how much more we need to know, all of us, both about Chicago's neighborhoods and the art worlds that they sustained. This is something which I think the Terra Initiative is expanding, and I hope you will take advantage of the many exhibitions, lectures, and publications that are being presented this year. Thank you very much for listening. And of course, absolutely, I'll be happy to. Maybe we could get the lights up a little bit. Staring at the spotlight.
Here?
I don't know, again, I know there are a couple of specialists here, how familiar these artists are to you, or were to you, and whether they are new or whether this is just something that, yes.
Was Frank Dudley outside of the boundaries of Hyde Park, the Dunes painter, or I just wondered?
I'm not sure what his studio or house address. I went through some artist directories. I had to find people who were living within the boundaries that I had set up. And I don't know, he may well have been. But
He was a South Sider, maybe.
Yes, there are others.
Just a little south of Hyde Park, maybe.
That I haven't mentioned. There were people who lived south of 60th Street, and there were people living north of 47th, but I decided just for purposes of tonight that I'd respect those boundaries. But in fact, we don't have an atlas of Chicago artists, which I think would be fun to create, and just see where they lived, where they moved to. This was a constantly shifting population. One of the things that I did discover in the course of research was something published in, I think it was 1940, called National Art Week. This was the WPA trying to get people to buy art and visit artist studios. So they list in a catalog the addresses of something like 1,000 Chicago artists. And I didn't chart them all, but there are several dozen who fit into the greater Hyde Park or slightly expanded Hyde Park area. And that I think would be rather interesting to see how things change over time. Yes?
Any thought of publishing that very excellent paper you just presented, will we get hold of it?
Well, and it's not really I mean, it's a synthetic paper. I've put together a lot of the work that others have done, but I don't know if it's worthy of publication or not, but maybe if someone is interested, I can always make it available. I don't know if it's worth the dignity of publication. And of course, you really need the pictures. And I had a hard time. I love to show images. I'm not an art historian, so I'm really prolific in my showing of images. I had a hard time cutting down the images that I show you from the group that I had assembled in Photoshop. There's a lot of wonderful stuff available, and some of this art, of course, is still being sold, and not at very advanced prices. So it's nice to know that it's semi-affordable, some of it anyway. Yes.
You may have covered this. We got in late. We tried to get in, but we couldn't get in that door. So we had to go downstairs and up again.
Oh, no.
But was Gertrude, I thought Gertrude Abercrombie lived in Hyde Park.
Yes,
Oh, we did talk.
yes. Well, I'll give you a special, yes, she had two addresses, and the house on Dorchester, I had a picture of, well, I won't go back to it now, but I can show you. Yes, she spent most of her working career here, and she attracted people. When we went to see the show at the Arts Club, I think one of the artists was Wild?
John
Wilda from Milwaukee. He used to come down, and Wilda, we thought, was a very interesting figure that we'd never encountered before. He came down just to be near her. She attracted a lot of people. She, of course, was one of her lovers was James Purdy. She had a rather interesting life, and there's a recent book, I think I made a note of it, by Deborah Seaman, on women artists, called Identity Unknown, which has a very interesting long chapter on Gertrude Abercrombie. Essentially, she was talking about artists who she felt had been understudied. And Gertrude Abercrombie, I don't think can be called understudied any longer. She is getting a lot of attention. And she's also represented in the Smart Museum. One of my hopes is that we could get into local collections more of the sampling of these artists. They're not, they can't really be seen in many cases. They haven't been systematically collected. And I think some of them, like Schofield, for example, who studied with Brewer Nordfeld in Provincetown, she's a very, very interesting artist. And that's true of a number of the others. Yes?
Is there any other book arts other than the Blue Sky Press in Hyde Park?
Well, there were certainly illustrators and book artists. The Blue Sky Press is one of these arts and crafts presses. The Philosopher Press in Wausau, Wisconsin is another. There are presses all over the country. So that movement runs its course. And there are probably a few people who did some private printing, but I don't know of any other press that could be likened to the Blue Sky. Of course, you have the University of Chicago Press, which is doing its own, from time to time, interesting graphic work, and the Donnelly plant is not so far away. It's a South Side operation, the Donnelly printing plant. They employed great book artists and typographers, and we have, they had their own apprentices program. Some of them may have lived on the South Side, but beyond that, I wouldn't be able to come up with a private press, another South Side private press. But somebody may know of them. Bill, again,
Might
you're
as well ask
entitled.
another
Yes?
question. What was the attraction of Hyde Park to artists?
Well, yes. I should ask, if I were in class, I'd say, okay, I'll call on someone.
I'll give you a chance to expound
It
again.
was, yes, I can, we all like to talk. I say it's a number of factors. I think it was the presence of the university. A number of them, as I say, were active in the dunes, doing landscape or graphic work there, and the dunes were nearby. You had good transportation downtown. There were interesting people around. There were exhibitions available. So I think all of that.
You mentioned cheap rents.
Yes, cheap. There were cheap rents available in the, at least in the old days. They had those studios. I mean, there were some, and there still are good reasons, I guess, for artists to live here. I don't know what today's artist population is like in Hyde Park, but there are a number of practicing artists here. But then it was a node, in the same way that the studio buildings in various parts of the city were. And again, I've not seen created a map which would be interesting to show the significant concentrations of practicing artists in different parts of Chicago. This was not alone, but I think these were multiple attractions, particularly in the 20s and 30s. When the area was a bit stranger, and when I started, I said that Hyde Park was changed in the 60s and 70s. It lost a little bit of the bohemian quality that I think distinguished it in its earlier years. And you only have to read the Chicago Tribune in the interwar years. Hyde Park is sort of treated with a high degree of suspicion, I think, as was modernism in general by Eleanor Jewett, who was the art critic of the Tribune and fulminated against all sorts of modern art. And I think those were the attractions, and the presence of a student body here, and again, you add the Renaissance Society and Midway and these 57th Street, and you have enough.
But it seems quite, I grew up in New York, it seems quite different from New York, because there was no artist community around Columbia. Most of the artists lived in the Village, or the East Village, or the West Village. It's true, NYU was
Yes.
there, but most of NYU at that time was up in the...
Well, some of it was
Heights.
up in where the Hall of Fame is, but I think that's an interesting question. When you start looking at New York and Chicago in this period as art centers, there are some fascinating contrasts, and I've thought that it would be wonderful to have a kind of exhibition of Chicago and New York painters at the same time, particularly urban scene painters.
Particularly what?
Painters of the urban scene,
Oh,
or Ashcan era painters. The Chicagoans were much influenced by Sloan and Bellows, who taught there at the school. Yes, I'm sorry.
This is an earlier time, but where the craftsmen were imported by Park for the Columbian Exposition, did they create a little economy of craft that spun out into a greater art world?
Well, that's an interesting question. Sharon Darling, of course, has written some very interesting books on Chicago crafts, and I'm sure there were people here, and occasionally you would run, and when I first came here, there were a few people, I don't know if they were the sons or daughters of Colombian workers, but they seemed to have tradition. A lot of these people came from Europe, and I don't know if those craft people stayed here or not. Some survivors of the exhibition remained here, but I don't have any information on the craft. And there were little craft studios, though, still in Hyde Park, and that's what Harper Court was meant to perpetuate. These quirky, little, distinctive, unique spots which had ceramists or weavers. They were pushed out in many cases because they were living in buildings that were taken down, they were ramshackle, etc. But I can't give you a decisive answer to that question. Yes.
I think maybe Hull House had some influence.
Oh,
on that,
yes.
too,
Yes.
through the years.
And some of these artists worked at Hull House and were were influenced by the Hull House people and the Hull House Museum, which again, it's not a Hyde Park institution, but the connections were there. And some of these artists were political in a sense. That is, they less overtly than, let's say, the artists in the show at the Smart, but there were a lot of European immigrants in the city, proportionately, at that point, that I think they had connections to, and they were interested in labor and the value of labor, and they had disputes with the system, as it were, and some of them were radical, political radicals, but you don't see the art as an overt expression of that necessarily, except in some cases. That 1911 series of lithographs, the Chicago scene, is quite interesting. I don't know a lot about it, and I don't know a lot about the politics of the artists who created it, but it would be interesting to know more. There is, of course, a big new text on the history of art in Chicago, which I haven't yet seen, which the Terra has funded, which is appearing in the next couple of weeks. So that may provide us with a lot more information. I don't know that it takes a neighborhood perspective, which is what I wanted to do here. But many of the artists that I speak about will be mentioned there. Well, you managed to last.
I keep going.
Yeah, well, the law school produces all these plays.
No, I was wondering, since I have a personal interest in the social realist artists, which were, as far as I know, they were left-wing, and there were a large number of them in Manhattan. Did the social realist movement ever
Yes,
move out in the Chicago
I think you could
area?
argue that some of the paintings, again, I don't know when you came in, and which.
At the end.
Oh, okay. Well, I did show a number of neighborhood scenes, and there are artists outside of Hyde Park who do what could be called social realist scenes, particularly, of course, in the 30s, when the city is represented as, a semi-disaster area. And Katz, A. Raymond Katz is one of them. I don't want to refer. I'll show you I'll go through the whole thing.
Did they survive in the sense that their works are being sold now and carried by galleries? I know, in the social realists in New York, there's still a thriving market for the secondary market for their works.
Well, I think in places like, say, the Norton Galleries, that's the principal access route, the commercial access route that I know. A number of them are, in fact, available. The graphic art is, and you see them. There is an auction that Leslie Heineman is having in the next couple of weeks, which contains some Chicago. But I don't think it's of the same intensity or even price levels.
There are 2 Gertrude Abercrombies up for sale.
Well,
They're very small, but they're still.
Well, she did some very small pictures.
So I apologize if you're, but how important was Hyde Park to the works of the black artists in the 30s and
Well, there were.
Norman Lewis, but there were Chicago artists.
Yes, but
Norman
Hyde Park itself really didn't have, until the 50s or 60s, black artists. And I showed at the very beginning the Charles White map, in which Hyde Park is empty. I mean, he's not involved in Hyde Park. And even the collectors, I don't know if you were here, got here for that, the African art collectors like Johnson, they came here relatively late. So this place, it's a white story until the 50s or 60s. So this is the prelude to what one sees at the Smart in the current exhibition there. Well, thank you all for staying, and thank you.
Thank you.